The backhoe bucket rose from the mud carrying something no construction worker expected to see. At first, it looked like pale debris caught in black peat. Then the operator recognized the curve of a human skull. More bones followed. The machine had been cutting through a shallow pond near Titusville, Florida, where a new residential development and road were being prepared. Within minutes, an ordinary construction project had become a possible crime scene. The sheriff was called. A medical examiner looked at the remains. Work stopped. But this was not a hidden murder from the previous night, the previous year, or even the previous century. Radiocarbon dating would eventually show that the people beneath that pond had been placed there roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, thousands of years before Egypt's Great Pyramids rose above the desert. The backhoe operator had not uncovered one body. He had struck the edge of an ancient cemetery containing the remains of 168 people, and the bones were only the beginning. Inside the waterlogged peat were woven cloth, wooden tools, plant foods, burial stakes, stomach contents, fragile tissue, and something archaeologists almost never expect to survive for 8 millennia, material recognizable as human brain tissue. The discovery became known as Windover. What came out of that small Florida pond did not reveal a lost city or an unknown empire. It revealed something more difficult to preserve and, in many ways, more important: the daily lives, illnesses, craftsmanship, care, and funerary decisions of people who left no written history. Windover forced archaeologists to confront how much had vanished from the usual picture of early America. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Wood, cloth, food, soft tissue, and the quiet evidence of compassion usually disappear. At Windover, they did not. The pond lies near Titusville on Florida's Atlantic coastal plain, only a few miles from the modern coastline and Cape Canaveral. Today, the surrounding landscape contains roads, homes, businesses, and the infrastructure of a modern community. During the early Archaic period, the coast was farther away because sea level was lower. The local environment contained freshwater wetlands, pine lands, hammocks, rivers, estuaries, and seasonal resources used by mobile hunter-gatherers. The site was not a settlement in the usual archaeological sense. Researchers found no permanent village built around the pond. The strongest interpretation is that Windover served as a mortuary place, a location to which people returned to bury their dead over approximately 1,000 years. The cemetery's chronology is sometimes simplified into one date, but the evidence covers a range. Radiocarbon measurements on human bone, peat, wooden stakes, and other material place the burials broadly between about 7,000 and 8,000 years before present, with some calibrated estimates extending older. The site belongs to Florida's Archaic period, when communities lived through hunting, fishing, plant gathering, seasonal movement, and detailed knowledge of local ecosystems. Calling these people primitive explains almost nothing. The word invites modern viewers to imagine small groups concerned only with finding the next meal, lacking complicated technologies or organized social life. Windover revealed a community that made several kinds of textiles, crafted objects from wood, shell, antler, bone, and stone, returned repeatedly to one sacred or socially meaningful location, and supported people who could not have survived alone. The two great mysteries were immediately connected. How had the pond been preserved so much? And what would those preserved materials reveal about people living in Florida before pottery, farming, cities, or written records? The discovery began in 1982 during construction at the Windover Farms development. The operator commonly identified in public accounts as Steve Vanderchacht was using a backhoe when human remains appeared in the spoil. At first, officials had to treat the bones as potentially recent. Archaeological age cannot be judged safely from appearance alone, especially when waterlogged environments alter color and texture. The remains reportedly looked surprisingly substantial. Some early observers even considered whether they might belong to relatively recent burials. The crime scene possibility faded as context, condition, and additional finds made an archaeological explanation more likely. Developers Jim Swan and Jack Eckerd did something that determined whether the site would survive. They halted work, contacted specialists, supported early testing, altered development plans, and helped provide equipment for excavation. Many archaeological sites are destroyed before their significance is understood. Windover remained available because construction did not simply continue through the pond. Initial radiocarbon tests returned ages of more than 7,000 years. That result transformed the site from a local discovery into a nationally important archaeological emergency. The pond contained one of North America's largest human skeletal collections, securely dated to such an early period. And the material was lying in a fragile wet environment disturbed by modern earth moving. Florida State University archaeologist Glenn Doran became the project's principal investigator, working with David Dickel and a multidisciplinary team. Excavation required far more than removing mud around skeletons. The burials rested beneath standing water and deep peat. If the site dried too quickly, wood, cloth, and bone that had remained waterlogged for thousands of years could shrink, crack, curl, or collapse. Researchers installed a system of well points around the pond to lower the water table gradually. Pumps removed water while archaeologists worked in wet peat, whose consistency was compared to chocolate mousse. Visibility was poor. Artifacts could be almost indistinguishable from the matrix surrounding them. A careless shovel movement could destroy a woven object before anyone knew it was there. The excavation took place across several field seasons during the 1980s. Archaeologists recovered the remains of 168 individuals, but only part of the pond was excavated. A substantial portion was deliberately left undisturbed, preserving material for the future and protecting part of the cemetery from further intervention. This choice matters. Archaeological methods improve. A sample consumed by one test can never be tested again. DNA techniques, chemical analyses, imaging, and conservation methods available decades later may answer questions the original excavators could not ask. Leaving part of Windover intact, recognize that discovery does not create an unlimited right to remove everything. The excavation also occurred before modern repatriation and consultation practices fully reshaped American archaeology. Human remains are not simply scientific specimens. They are ancestors. And research involving indigenous burials now takes place within legal and ethical frameworks requiring consultation, respect, and careful decisions about access, analysis, curation, and possible return. Windover's excavation produced extraordinary knowledge, but it also belongs to a broader history in which Native American remains were often collected and studied without the consent of descendant communities. Any modern account should hold the scientific importance and the ethical responsibility together. The pond's preservation came from a rare combination of water, peat, chemistry, burial method, and environmental stability. Peat forms when plant material accumulates faster than it fully decomposes. Waterlogged sediment limits oxygen. Many bacteria, fungi, insects, and scavengers that normally break down a body become less active when oxygen is scarce. Organic acids and dissolved compounds can further change decomposition. Cool, stable, wet conditions reduce some of the cycles of drying, heating, and exposure that destroy delicate material. This does not mean every peat bog preserves every body. European bog bodies are famous for skin and hair preserved in acidic peat while bone may dissolve. Windover was different. Its chemistry allowed unusually good preservation of bone alongside organic artifacts. The pond's local geology, groundwater peat layers, burial depth, and chemical environment created conditions not easily reproduced elsewhere. The bodies had been intentionally submerged in soft peat near the pond's edge. Many were wrapped or covered in textiles and held in place with wooden stakes or branches. Once enclosed in the oxygen-poor sediment, the remains were protected from surface scavengers and rapid decay. The preservation was uneven. Some skeletons were disturbed or mixed. Others remained articulated, meaning the bones were still arranged in anatomical relationship. Wood and cloth could be preserved in one area and absent in another. Soft tissue was not intact, like a recently deceased body. What survived had been transformed, compressed, chemically altered, and sometimes replaced by material from the surrounding environment. Then the team opened skulls and found dark, greasy-looking masses inside. At first, the material could have been peat that had entered after decomposition. Microscopic, anatomical, and molecular studies showed that some samples retained structures consistent with brain tissue. Early nature research described gross anatomical features, remnant cellular structure, and human molecular material in specimens approximately 8,000 years old. The first published report involved only the early portion of the excavation, when 9 individuals with intracranial material had been recovered, and 5 showed recognizable preserved or replaced brain tissue. Later excavation reports and public summaries state that intracranial material occurred in many more skulls, often giving a figure of 91. The safe conclusion is not that 91 perfect brains survived. It is that Windover preserved intracranial soft material in an extraordinary number of individuals, with multiple samples showing identifiable brain tissue characteristics. Brain tissue is among the first organs expected to break down after death. It contains high amounts of water and fat, lacks the structural durability of bone, and is rapidly attacked by enzymes and microbes. Finding even partial cellular or anatomical traces after 8 millennia is globally rare. The discovery opened the possibility of ancient DNA research at a time when the field was still young. Early teams reported genetic material from Windover tissue, including work that was technologically groundbreaking for the 1980s and 1990s. Those early claims must now be treated carefully. Ancient DNA is vulnerable to contamination from excavators, laboratory staff, soil organisms, and modern handling. Methods that once appeared convincing may not meet current standards involving clean rooms, independent replication, damage patterns, and genome-wide sequencing. Windover has not yet produced the kind of comprehensive, high-coverage genomic study that could securely answer every question about population ancestry and biological relationships. This is one of the site's remaining mysteries. The tissue preserved enough information to transform science, but a complete modern genetic portrait remains unresolved and ethically sensitive. The peat's greatest archaeological gift may not have been brain tissue. It may have been cloth. Textiles are so vulnerable that prehistory often appears almost naked. Stone projectile points survive and become symbols of entire cultures. Spears, nets, bags, clothing, blankets, baskets, cordage, and wooden implements decay, even though those objects may have required more labor and been more important in daily life. Windover reversed that imbalance. Excavators recovered dozens of textile specimens associated with burials. Specialists identified at least 7 weaving or fabric structures, including close and open twining, diagonal twining, paired and trebled elements, braiding, cordage, and balanced plane weave. Some fabrics appear to have been produced with non-heddle loom techniques rather than by casually twisting plant fibers together. The collection includes the oldest known textiles from the American Southeast, and one of the largest, most sophisticated early fiber assemblages in the New World. It should not be described casually as the single oldest cloth anywhere in the Americas without qualification. Other early fiber technologies, mats, cords, nets, and textile evidence exist at sites in North and South America. Windover's importance comes from age, preservation, number, variety, and direct association with individual burials. The surviving pieces suggest bags, mats, blankets, clothing, hoods, and possible burial shrouds. Some bodies were wrapped in fabric before being placed in the pond. Children and adults could be associated with different woven items and other grave goods. A piece of fabric records knowledge that a stone point cannot. Someone had to identify suitable plants, harvest fibers at the correct time, strip and process them, twist strands consistently, plan the structure, maintain tension, repair mistakes, and understand how the final material would stretch, insulate, carry, cover, or wrap. These skills were probably learned through observation and years of practice. The variety indicates that Windover's people did not possess one crude weaving method. They had a technological system. Different structures served different functions. A carrying bag required strength and flexibility. Clothing needed comfort and movement. A burial covering could communicate care, identity, or ritual obligation. The textile evidence also exposes a bias in how archaeologists once described hunter-gatherers. When organic technology disappears, later observers may assume it never existed. Windover showed that sophisticated fiber industries were present thousands of years earlier than many people imagined in this region. The people did not live in a world made only of stone. They lived in a world of cloth, wood, cord, hide, shell, bone, plants, and objects whose disappearance made their culture look simpler than it was. Wooden artifacts included stakes used in burials and more complex worked forms. Bone and antler were shaped into tools. Marine shells traveled inland from coastal environments or reflected movement through a broad landscape. Bottle gourd fragments provided early evidence for containers made from cultivated or managed plants. The site's artifacts reveal mobility rather than isolation. People used river, wetland, terrestrial, and coastal resources. They carried knowledge across habitats and returned to the same mortuary pond over many generations. Windover also preserved evidence of food. Stable isotope analysis of human bone collagen and archaeobotanical study indicated a diet relying strongly on riverine and estuarine resources alongside terrestrial plants. The results did not support the idea that deer, rabbit, or marine mammals dominated the diet, even though such animals may still have been eaten. Plant remains included grapes, prickly pear, elderberry, persimmon, maypop, hackberry, black gum, cabbage palm, nuts, seeds, aquatic plants, and other species that could provide fruit, starch, oil, greens, flavoring containers, or medicine. Researchers collected samples from peat surrounding burials and from areas corresponding to the abdomen or lower digestive tract. Comparing burial samples with background peat helped identify which seeds might represent food inside the body rather than plants naturally present in the pond. One elderly woman, identified as Burial 125, provided the strongest possible evidence of a final meal. A sample near her sacrum contained more than 3,000 seeds, most of them elderberry, along with grape and prickly pear. Small fish remains were also present, although researchers noted that some bones could have entered from the surrounding environment. The evidence does not let us reconstruct a complete dinner plate with certainty. It does show that preserved digestive contents can bring us closer to one person's final days than stone artifacts ever could. The plant assemblage also indicated that many burials occurred in late summer or early fall when the identified fruits were available. Growth rings on several burial stakes suggested that wood had been cut during a similar season. This does not necessarily mean Windover was used only once each year or that every person died seasonally. It suggests that the community returned to the pond or occupied the surrounding region during particular times, and that burial activity may have clustered within those periods. Some plants found with the dead had known medicinal uses among later indigenous societies, including wax myrtle, holly, nightshade, and other species. Calling them medicine at Windover requires caution. A plant can be edible, toxic, medicinal, symbolic, accidental, or used for several purposes. Ethnographic knowledge from recent communities cannot be projected unchanged across 7,000 years. The evidence supports familiarity with a wide range of useful plants. In a few cases, association with sick individuals or unusual contexts may suggest treatment, but it does not prove a prescribed medical system. The bones provide stronger evidence of health and survival. The cemetery included males and females, infants, children, adolescents, adults, and older people. This was not a burial place for warriors, elites, or one catastrophe. It represented a cross-section of a living community over many generations. Some individuals showed healed fractures. Others had osteoarthritis, dental problems, infection, interrupted growth, or injuries. Healing proves survival beyond the initial event. A broken bone that remodels shows that the person lived long enough for the body to repair it. Severe disability raises the deeper question of how that survival was possible. The most powerful case was an adolescent approximately 15 years old with a severe neural tube defect involving spina bifida, a purda, across the lower spine. The skeleton also showed spinal deformity, fragile bones, and major impairment. One lower limb had been lost or severely damaged, and the surviving bone showed healing. The original research described a complex condition that likely caused serious disability. Popular retellings sometimes state with complete confidence that the teenager was paralyzed below the waist and carried everywhere throughout life. The precise level of movement cannot be reconstructed with certainty from bone alone. But the central conclusion remains. This young person survived for approximately 15 years with congenital abnormalities and physical limitations that would have made independent mobility, food gathering, protection, and movement through wetlands extraordinarily difficult. Someone fed this child, someone protected them, someone helped them travel or adjusted the group's movement around their needs. Someone continued that support through years when the individual could not have contributed in the same way as a fully mobile hunter or gatherer. Then, after death, the adolescent was placed within the same cemetery used for the rest of the community. This is direct evidence against the idea that care began only with farming, cities, wealth, or formal institutions. Hunter-gatherer life demanded cooperation. Food sharing, childcare, injury treatment, knowledge transfer, and protection were not optional signs of softness. They were survival systems. Compassion and practicality do not need to be separated. Caring for a disabled child may reflect affection, kinship, moral obligation, spiritual belief, social identity, or all of them. The adolescent may also have contributed through memory, observation, communication, craft, or other activities invisible in the skeleton. Disability does not equal uselessness. Windover cannot tell us the child's name or personality. It can tell us that a person requiring long-term assistance remained part of the group. Older adults offer related evidence. Arthritis and degenerative change could make movement painful. Surviving into advanced age meant continuing to receive food and protection during periods of reduced physical capacity. Elders may have provided ecological knowledge, childcare, craft skill, oral history, and decision-making. A community's strength is not measured only by how many healthy adults can hunt. It is also measured by whether people survive when they cannot. The cemetery preserved injuries that may have resulted from accidents or violence. One individual had a projectile point embedded in the pelvis. Others showed cranial trauma. Windover was not an untouched world of peace. Care existed beside danger. Technology existed beside hardship. Long-term burial traditions existed beside mobility. This complexity is exactly what the site restored. The mortuary pattern was deliberate. Many individuals were placed in flexed positions, commonly on the left side, with heads oriented generally westward. Bodies were wrapped, covered, or associated with woven materials. Sharpened wooden stakes penetrated or held the textile coverings down in the soft pond bottom, preventing bodies from rising or shifting as gases formed during decomposition. Larger stakes may have marked burial areas or helped organize the cemetery. Burials occurred in clusters and episodes across centuries, suggesting that people remembered where earlier dead had been placed even as the shoreline and peat changed. This was not random disposal in a convenient swamp. The pond was returned to repeatedly as a place for the dead. Some publications suggest that bodies were submerged within approximately 48 hours of death, based partly on articulation and preservation. That level of precision should be presented cautiously. Archaeologists can infer relatively prompt burial when joints remain connected and scavenging, or insect damage is limited, but they cannot place a modern stopwatch beside every death. The strongest conclusion is that many bodies were prepared and placed in the pond before advanced decomposition. Burial required work. People had to wrap the body, carry it to the pond, enter or reach into the water, position it, push stakes through fabric into peat, and leave objects with it. The act was physically demanding and emotionally structured. Grave goods varied. Tools, containers, shell ornaments, bone objects, textiles, and personal items accompanied some individuals. Children were not treated as socially invisible. Some younger burials contained substantial textile and artifact associations. The distribution should not be turned into a rigid map of male and female roles without careful analysis. Objects can reflect identity, age, family occupation, affection, ritual, or circumstances of death. But deliberate selection is clear. The dead were not merely removed from camp. They were prepared. The pond's meaning remains unknown. Water may have represented passage, renewal, boundary, ancestry, protection, or none of the categories modern observers imagine. The soft peat may have offered a practical burial environment, while repeated use transformed practicality into tradition. Archaeology can identify behavior more confidently than belief. The stakes prove anchoring. The textiles prove wrapping. The repeated cemetery proves memory. The exact spiritual explanation remains beyond the evidence. That uncertainty should not tempt us to invent secret rituals. The verified facts are already extraordinary. A mobile community maintained a mortuary place for roughly a millennium. Generation after generation knew where to return. They repeated recognizable burial practices while allowing variation. Their relationship with the pond survived longer than many modern towns, governments, and institutions. That continuity requires social memory. Someone taught younger people the route. Someone remembered who belonged there. Someone knew how the dead should be positioned and what should accompany them. The cemetery was a form of history before writing. Windover transformed the early archaic period because it restored the organic half of life that dry archaeological sites erase. Without the pond, researchers might have recovered scattered stone points and bones and described a simple hunting population. With the pond, the same people became textile workers, woodworkers, plant specialists, caregivers, fishers, mourners, patients, elders, children, and families. Their technology was not advanced because it resembled modern machinery. It was advanced because it was precise, varied, learned, and suited to the world they inhabited. Their society was not complex because it had kings or monuments. It was complex because people occupied different ages and conditions, shared knowledge, maintained obligations, and returned to a meaningful place across many centuries. Their compassion is not proven by one sentimental story. It is visible in survival. The adolescent with spina bifida lived for years beyond what independent mobility likely allowed. Injured people healed. Older adults endured chronic degeneration. Children received careful burial. The cemetery included the entire human cycle rather than selecting only the powerful. This does not mean Windover's people were morally perfect. It means they were human in ways the word primitive often denies. Many questions remain. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know how many separate bands used the cemetery, how far they traveled, or whether every burial belonged to one biological community. We do not know the full kinship structure inside burial clusters. Modern genomic methods might clarify biological relationships and population history, but ancient DNA work requires careful preservation assessment, contamination control, consultation, and ethical authority. Early molecular findings cannot simply be expanded into claims about race, migration, or modern tribal identity. No responsible genetic study could declare that Windover's people were unrelated to Native Americans because one early test failed to match limited modern samples. Absence of a match in a small data set is not proof of a vanished race. The Windover people were indigenous inhabitants of ancient Florida. Connecting them to specific living nations requires evidence and consultation that may be difficult across such a long period. The site itself is protected as a National Historic Landmark. The surrounding development continued in altered form, but the pond was preserved and part of the cemetery remains unexcavated. Exhibits and reconstructions can explain the discovery without displaying human remains as spectacle. Legal and ethical practices now restrict how ancestral remains and funerary objects are studied, curated, and presented. The future of Windover research depends not only on what technology can extract, but on what consultation and respect permit. That is not an obstacle to knowledge. It is part of doing the work correctly. The backhoe that struck the pond could easily have erased the cemetery. Instead, the discovery became a warning about what lies beneath ordinary landscapes. A retention pond, road cut, housing development, quarry, or drainage project can intersect with thousands of years of human history without any monument visible at the surface. Windover had no pyramid. No stone wall announced it. The cemetery survived because water hid it. The title says a backhoe operator found 168 bodies. The more accurate story is that one construction worker exposed the first warning, and years of controlled excavation revealed 168 individuals. Each person expanded the picture. One preserved a final meal, another carried an embedded projectile, another survived severe disability. Dozens were associated with fabrics that should have vanished. Many retained traces of a burial process repeated for centuries. Together, they changed the meaning of ancient. 8,000 years can feel like an empty distance. Windover filled it with recognizable acts. Someone gathered elderberries. Someone twisted fiber. Someone wove cloth tightly enough to wrap a child. Someone cut a pine stake late in the growing season. Someone supported an adolescent who could not move easily. Someone entered the pond carrying a body. Someone returned years later and remembered where the others lay. The site does not make these people modern. It makes them visible. That visibility carries a final responsibility. Archaeology often becomes most exciting when preservation is intimate: hair, skin, stomach contents, brains, disability, and death. But intimacy can become exploitation if the dead are treated only as shocking objects. The people of Windover did not place their relatives in the pond so that strangers 8,000 years later could stare at them. They buried them according to a tradition that mattered. The scientific value lies in learning from that tradition without forgetting whose bodies made the learning possible. Windover's greatest discovery was not that brain tissue survived. It was that an entire social world survived around it. The cloth showed planning. The food showed ecological knowledge. The injuries showed hardship. The healed bones showed endurance. The disabled child showed sustained care. The pond showed memory. Nothing in that list requires a lost civilization, forbidden technology, or extraordinary claim. The evidence is powerful because it is ordinary human life preserved where ordinary human life almost always disappears. The backhoe blade opened the ground looking for a road. What it found was a community older than the pyramids, waiting beneath a Florida pond with its craftsmanship, compassion, and dead still held together in the peat. The real question is not how people so ancient could have been so much like us. It is why we never expected them not to be. Windover remains extraordinary because it preserves relationships usually erased by time. The pond held bodies, but it also held the work of hands, the memory of families, and evidence that survival depended on knowledge and care. 8,000 years later, the discovery still asks the same question. When we imagine the earliest Americans, do we picture strangers defined by distance or people whose grief, skill, responsibility, and love were already unmistakably human?